Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to be back in Riyadh. My wife and I were here about 7 or 8 years ago. That time we spent all our time at the university, King Saud University. I'm excited to be able to see more of Saudi Arabia, and I'm very impressed with the program that has been put together for this conference. I looked through the program and I'm amazed at the quality of the people you have been able to assemble, and of course it also means that the country has the right attitude to put together something like that. I have a little bit of experience with both traveling and spending time in the Middle East, mostly in Qatar, where I teach every winter and spring. This coming one will be the 4th in a row at Carnegie Mellon's outpost in Education City of Qatar. I've been delighted to have very good students in my class, and one thing I admit I like is that every time the majority, more than 50% of my students have been girls, and I think that's a very good sign. I would like to use as a theme that economic policy may play a significant role for economic growth, for sustainable economic growth. There are several reasons to think that's the case. For one thing, the fact that the situation is so different in many parts of the world is a sign. It's hard to think of an explanation that doesn't involve differences in policies in different regions or different countries. That's true in the long run, and I've discovered after the global financial crisis, evidently it's also true in the shorter run. What has happened after 2008 has been quite different in different parts of the world, suggesting that they took different actions and as a consequence, different outcomes. Before I get into that, let's just take a picture at a few countries in the world. It's a little bit idiosyncratic, but I think it makes a little bit of a point. So here are the United States, Canada, and Australia. United States, I suppose you could think of as like a benchmark for what can be done. Canada and Australia are not far behind. Here's an example of Eastern Asian countries. So we have Korea, Japan, and Hong Kong. I could have thrown in Taiwan. It would have looked quite similar. And then I have three countries, three Latin American countries. Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. And you have to agree with me, if we compare the last three countries with the three before, these are quite different. Very different in growth. Even though they started more or less at the same point in around 1960, Korea, even below any of these other three countries, Latin American countries, they quickly overtook them. and then they have grown spectacularly. What could be the reason for this difference? Well, I thought I'd throw in a couple of new countries, and these used to be part of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. I know a little bit about them because I've been to forums in those countries, I think 5 times at the Astana Economic Forum and 3 times at the Baku Humanitarian Forum. I actually like this forum way better than either of those forums because, and that's one thing I admire about this forum, how focused it is. I have a center myself at the University of California, Santa Barbara, called Laboratory for Aggregate Economics and Finance. We put on about 6 conferences a year. And what we like to do is put on very focused conferences, getting together people who have thought about the same issues, and often you end up with having discovered something, come up with some answers during the conference. I like focused conferences, and this is clearly one of them. Now, I don't really have time to go into big detail about those 2 countries, except, as you can see, both fell on hard times initially, but then they've done quite spectacularly since about 2000. Kazakhstan, for example, let me make the point that, or remind you, this is not proportional scale. So a given steepness far down in the picture, like here, corresponds to a much higher annual percentage growth than the same steepness high up in the picture. So that's one point. In Kazakhstan, I had the opportunity to talk to people in the government, and they say now that they've grown so fast, it's hard to find people with the right skills to keep the momentum going. That's a rather benign problem to have, and as a consequence, I've observed that over the 5 years I've been going there, they seem to be doing the right thing, namely upgrading their existing universities. They have even started a couple of new universities. They are trying to build up the skills. One could argue while they're doing so, they might be more conducive to importing skills from abroad for a while. They seem to be somewhat reluctant to do so, but anyway, that's the kind of thing a government can do to, or can be done to make sure you get the right people together to go sustainably. I'll throw in a final country in this picture, China, which is, it gets some press these days because supposedly it's about to overtake the United States as the biggest country in terms of total economic activity. Some people are surprised to see they're not higher than this when we do it in per capita terms. So this is a picture of real GDP per capita, which by an accounting definition means real income per capita. So in that sense, an interesting picture. Now, so I've used this in part to allude to the idea that economic policy plays a role for for nations' growth. I could have thrown in more Latin American countries. They would have given about the same picture. I could have thrown in, as I said, Taiwan and one or two others. And the pairs of groups of countries would still have looked very different. Now, to organize our thinking about economic growth, we often refer to, certainly in economic models, to the production function. So here's the production function. It says that the amount of GDP produced in a nation, which is a sum of consumption, investment, government purchases, and a difference between exports and imports. It's a function of three things. It's a function of the interaction between capital, the nation's factories, machines, office buildings, and so on, and the workers. A function of capital and labor at any given time t. But then there's the technology level, Z. Z comes about because of innovative activity. Businesses learn how to make things better. They come up with new products and so on. Innovative activity. What this conference is about is in Z. Z is as I said, it's a powerful thing. I mean, the way I've written it, output, GDP, is proportional to Z. That's an approximation, but it's pretty close to the truth. So that makes it very powerful. A stylized description of what typically happens as nations grow is there's technological change, capital is accumulated to take advantage of it, the businesses hire workers, workers' incomes go up as a consequence of the technological change, and the nation does better over the long run. So Z is clearly an important factor. Now, what's important about this production function from the perspective of my talk today is to point out there are three factors here. They're the result of the decisions of thousands, if not millions, of households or people, thousands of businesses. L, for example, is the total labor input in the nation. K is the sum of all the factories, machines, and office buildings. They've come about because of decisions by thousands of businesses, and also the technology level is a result of what has happened in lots of businesses. But what's important for me today is to point out these are very forward-looking decisions. So when businesses think about innovative activity, evidently you all know this at this conference, these are costly decisions as they take place. In particular, when it comes to innovative activity, often the results are also quite uncertain. So uncertain outcomes, costly as they take place. It better be the case that there are returns to make up for it, but these returns come over many years in the future. Same thing with capital. For example, if you build a factory that costs millions of dollars, it may take a year or more to build it. The returns to make up for that cost could come over 10 or 50 years into the future. There's also a sense in which forward-lookingness of decisions come into play in the labor input. As a first approximation, one might think that L would be more or less similar to the growth of the population or the growth in working age people in the economy. But actually, in a well-functioning economy, L should grow faster than the population. It should go faster because of the presence of education, the presence of learning by doing. Each worker becomes more productive over time as time goes on. And decisions about education potentially is also a very much forward-looking decision, one that is costly as it takes place, and returns will come over decades in the future. Okay, so that's my first theoretical underpinning for my talk. My second is to point out, in market economies, there is a problem. And this problem is related to the forward-lookingness of the decisions I just talked about. There's a problem, and it goes as follows. So we could think about, let me first say, so the sense in which the government comes into the picture here is they tax future returns. They may put in place regulations, new regulations, which will be as if they're taxing businesses a little more. So the government has the power to affect these future returns that are supposed to make up for the high cost of taking these decisions about innovative activity, capital accumulation, and so on. The government has that power. Now you may ask, so what would be the best policy that the government could carry on? What would be the best policy in the interest of the nation's citizens? What would be the optimal policy? Well, if everyone were alike, presumably there would be the policy that maximized the utility function of the typical inhabitant, but everyone is not alike, so it's maybe a little difficult to come up with a mathematical expression to indicate what the welfare functions now and indefinitely far into the future would look like. But economists are used to working with abstractions, and so let's go with that. So imagine that policymakers they have come up with a mathematical expression that indicates citizens' welfare, as I just described, and they try to make it as high as possible, maximize it. And the resulting policy plan, also now and indefinitely far into the future, that's what we would call the optimal policy plan. And here's where the problem comes in. That plan is inconsistent over time. And so there's always a temptation, suppose one goes ahead with that plan, there will also always be a temptation to deviate from that plan in the future because it may seem optimal at the time in that future to do so for reasons I'll explain soon. So this also has the implication that it would be nice if one had a way to commit the government to the optimal plan. It would be nice to have a commitment mechanism. In the monetary area, we have understood that, and actually there is a potential commitment mechanism. and that is to make the central bank independent from political pressure. And it tends to be the case that the more independent central banks are, the more benign is the behavior of the price level and so on that results from the central bank's decisions. In the fiscal arena, which I would argue under normal circumstances, and certainly in the long run, is much more important. I mean, tax policy and regulatory policy and so on, much more important for sustainable growth. It's hard to see how fiscal policy can be credibly committed. But I'll give you an example where somehow that turned out to be possible. So let me turn to similar pictures for some European countries. So this is a collection of United Kingdom, France, Germany, and I threw in a smaller country, Austria. They follow each other pretty well. Then I have three slightly more problematic countries. There's Greece, Spain, and Italy. And I mean, they tend to be lower. Actually, Italy did pretty well for a while, but they have really faltered recently. So they're essentially identical with Spain towards the end. And then I'm going to throw in a fourth country at the bottom. So here is Ireland, and I haven't completed the picture here. It's maybe a little hard to see because it overlaps somewhat with other countries for part of it. But so this curve for Ireland ends in 1990. What's special about 1990? So Ireland made secondary education free of charge in the late 60s and the 70s. As a consequence, by 1990, Ireland finds itself with a potentially skilled workforce. But no factories, no capital in which to work. Ireland decided to make fiscal policy, to make tax policy completely certain. Remove all uncertainty about future fiscal policy. They said, if you, whether you're Irish or foreign company, if you set up shop in Ireland, these will be your tax rates in 1992, 93, 94, and so on, all the way to 2009. Past the lifetime of a typical factory. And that removal of uncertainty, you may ask why one would do them, but evidently Ireland had no history of trying to trick people, and so the outcome was spectacular. Within a decade, Ireland had overtaken these other top four countries I had pictured. One wishes that the story had a better ending because as one got into the 2000s, Irish banks became more risk-taking, let's say. They started giving loans to, for example, construction projects that turned out ex post not to be such a good idea. So when the financial crisis hit in other countries, Ireland was also affected, and major banks found themselves illiquid. Now, the government, the government did a good thing in 1990, but this was clearly the result of a failure by the government because they decided to bail out the illiquid banks. A principle in economics is you don't insure somebody without putting a regulatory framework in place to make sure it's not taken advantage of it. In this case, presumably the banks predicted that by taking a lot of risk, if something went bad, the government would indeed bail them out. So that was a fault by the government, but that doesn't take away from the smartness of the decision around 1990 and the effect it had. Now, this bailout cost a lot. It saddled, I think it was a mistake, it saddled taxpayers with a large debt. The debt to GDP ratio shot up so high that Ireland, after the Greece problems, Ireland was often mentioned in the same breath with Spain, Italy, and Portugal as potential future problem countries. Now, in the spirit of what I told you about, the inconsistency of optimal government policy, which, if there is no commitment mechanism, tends to result in policy being very short-run oriented rather than the more important long run. In this, one could have thought that if Ireland if they were not truly committed to this policy, they could have done the following, which is what the timing consistency principle predicts happens in countries with weak institutions, not so clear property rights, and so on. Ireland could have said, as a result of this policy we put in place, now there are plenty of factories in the nation, plenty of machines, and so on. It's true that we promised so-and-so tax rates, but suppose we tax them anyway. So let's say the tax rate was 10%, and we raise the tax rate to 30%. That clearly affects the returns that they would get, and but they probably wouldn't close down as a consequence of such a rise in tax rates. So the reason this is so tempting is it seems almost like a lump sum tax. Lump sum tax meaning it has no effect on economic activity. The government would get higher revenue. It's true they would have tricked these companies that made decisions years earlier based on lower tax rates. But the output from the factories would still be more or less the same. So that's the nature of the temptation. Now, if Ireland had gone ahead and fallen for that temptation, we understand that in the long run it would have been a bad idea, because now future potential investors will think, and by the way, presumably Ireland would have said, we'll do that this time, this is an emergency, we'll never do it again. Well, would we believe that? And that's the key. And so such a decision presumably would have affected future investment behavior in Ireland and led to inferior outcomes from then on, except for the very short run where they were able to the government was able to get some short-run revenue. So that's the nature of the time and consistency problem, and it's something that once one understands that principle, one also understands quite a bit of what has happened in economic history over time, things having to do with the gold standard and so on. I won't talk about that today. Now, so that is a problem, a general problem in market economies. Let me turn now to, so in my talk I will use as examples of things that work and things that don't work from different parts of the world. Let me turn to these four countries I already mentioned: Spain, Italy, and Portugal, and I'll keep Ireland in the picture as well. And my motivation is they were mentioned as often as potential problem countries after the Greece problems. So I decided to take a look at those countries and especially take a look at two indicators of whether a country is doing well in terms of growth or not. So there is a concept called total factor productivity. And that's more or less like the Z in the production function. A very important concept, and one can find data for total factor productivity. Also did a picture for labor productivity, which means you just divide the amount of output by the number of hours worked, and that's what we call labor productivity. And that picture looks quite similar. These are shocking pictures. They say that productivity in these three nations, Spain, Italy, and Portugal, came to a full stop in the 90s. Now, once I discovered this a few years ago, I started including these in the picture. You may recall that when these problem countries were pointed out, sometimes you heard that, well, the problem is the euro. We're a member of the Eurozone, our exchange rate is fixed. We wish we weren't a member of the Eurozone, we could have devalued or something to alleviate these problems. That argument, I always thought, was a red herring. Now, in case you haven't heard the English term red herring, it means an issue that's essentially irrelevant, but distracts from the real issue. And so those pictures would suggest much more deep-seated problems that these countries will have to deal with, and just changing the exchange rate would not do it. But then after a while, I've been going to the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas a few times a year, and started talking to a Spanish economist there. And after a while, it dawned on us, maybe it's not a complete red herring. I mean, one reason one could argue it's a red herring is they became members of the Eurozone after the full stop of productivity. But of course, the announcement that they were going to become members eventually was made well before. And so, and once that announcement was made, Then presumably the interest rates of those nations fell. Interest rates you can think of as the world interest rate plus a country risk factor. And presumably once a country that used to be quite risky becomes a member of the Eurozone, lots of people would think now they're less risky, so the risk premium falls. This researcher at the Dallas Fed, his name is Enrique Martinez, we worked out some theory, and it turns out that has the effect. A dramatic drop in the interest rate of a country has an effect such as what happened in Spain. And this, you can see this as rather dramatic. So the type of stuff countries produce, you can divide them, you can divide the output into two types. It produces traded goods, goods that are sold domestically, but also abroad, or potentially sold abroad. We call those the traded goods sector. And then we have the non-traded goods sector, producing stuff that there's no hope you can ever sell it abroad. Right? A haircut, you know, lots of domestic construction activity, lots of examples of non-traded goods. In the 80s, the proportion was about half and half. By 2008 to 2010, down to 1/3 traded goods, 2/3 non-traded goods. I don't have time to talk about the model output lines. Just pay attention to the blue line. It gives the productivity in the traded sector. Also pay attention to the vertical scale. This implies about 3% annual growth of the technology level in the traded goods sector. In the non-traded goods sector, look at how close the scale is there. About 1/3% in the non-traded sector. This is clearly a big factor in causing the full stop in these countries. Ireland, it's possible to compare productivity in these four nations. In Ireland, even though there's a slowdown recently, productivity in Ireland is still about on the order of 40 or 50% higher than in these other three nations. And that suggests to me that Ireland, unless they do something stupid, they're likely to do well in the long run. Let's see. Am I out of time? Or I see. Okay. Then I didn't have quite the 45 minutes I expected. I had the United States as an example, and let me just give you the bottom line on. Oops. What did I do now? Oh. I guess huh. Oh, this means I cannot do anything more. Is that? Okay. Then I'll give the bottom line without the picture. So in the United States, there the message is future fiscal sentiment that the tax rate is likely to rise in the future, like 5 years later, will affect the economy immediately. And it turns out that accounts very, very well for what actually happened in the United States after the global financial crisis. And the final example I had was China. China to me, so notice in the time and consistency problem, I was talking about optimal government policy. That means that consistent policy, you may have gotten the impression that it's the consistency that's important, but that's not sufficient. It has to be good policy. To me, China is an example of bad economic policy. It's as consistent as they come, but bad economic policy because of the state-run banks being state-run. They tend to favor the state-run companies or state-owned companies. Entrepreneurs, the small to medium-sized companies, have a hard time getting funding for their innovative activities, often having to save up in advance to get going and tend to get biased towards more labor-intensive activities than otherwise. So bottom line for China is with the same use of resources, they could have grown substantially faster. I had a picture for Chile and Mexico, where they were in the same situation in '82. Banks were insolvent in Chile. The government stepped in, closed the banks that were deemed to be not viable for the future. The rest they reprivatized within 3 or 4 years, and economic activity picked up. In Mexico, the government was reluctant to do the same thing. They kept the banks in the hands of bureaucrats, and I suppose one of the messages I have is that bureaucrats are not the ones likely to know what are the best projects to give loans. It's key to give the private economy an environment in which they can prosper and innovate. The final message, I guess, is pretty clear, and that is the best thing a government can do is to try to convince investors about what the policy will be far into the future. Not just what you're doing today, but what you will do 5 or 10 years from now. To give them confidence we're not going to do something silly, such as what, for example, Argentina tends to do. Argentina economic policy tends to be very short-run oriented. As a consequence, today the capital stock in Argentina is in fact lower than it was in 1982. Argentina has very little confidence among investors as a result of all the short-run policy they have carried out over, in fact, decades. So I guess that's the message, and I have no pictures to back that up, but you have to take my word for it in that case. Thank you very much for listening.